I'm Melissa Nielsen, and welcome to 2023.
Parenting and homeschooling can feel like a large feat to take on. Melissa Nielsen is here sharing her 26 years experience to help us. Melissa will inspire you with foundations for early childhood, Waldorf curriculum by the grade, middle school and high school resources, planning for peace, form drawing, beeswax modeling, wet-on-wet painting, inner work, temperaments, music, handwork, festivals, eurythmy, circle time, creating a co-op, homeschooling multiple children, conscious parenting, special needs, peaceful bedtime, and much more.
We're going to be doing our podcast in a two-piece format. So the first piece will be here on YouTube or on the podcast platform where you can listen to it for free. And the second piece, which is a deeper piece, a little more like going behind the scenes with Melissa a little bit. How do I actually apply these things in my life? And sometimes some juicier content. That is going to be available on our Patreon. Hello, and welcome to our podcast. I'm so glad you're joining me today. I'm Melissa Nielsen, and I want to talk to you today about grade 2. So actually what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the literature content specifically in class 2. And then our next podcast, we will have a class 2 teacher, longtime homeschooler, and a teacher that works for us over at Seasons of 7. She'll be joining me, and we'll sort of talk about the whole impulse behind class 2. Today, we're just going to focus on the literature. So the literature might be your first place in Waldorf where you're like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I can do this, because some of it feels a little religious or out of your comfort zone, and I just want to sort of help you with that. So we're going to take this podcast just like we always do. We'll do 2 parts. So this first part, we're going to just really talk about the books that I recommend, the stories that I recommend, why they're recommended. And then in the second part of our podcast, in part 2 that you can find over on our Patreon, we're going to talk about sort of celebrating some festivals, especially if you're new to some of the saint content, or it's not something that is part of your family values. So we'll talk about that a little bit. We'll also talk about sort of going deeper and balancing some of the story content based on your child, and sort of what you can do also to have it work with their behavior, anything that you've got going on. So that's a lot. Let's get started. First, I want to say that if you are writing your own class 2 or not using a curriculum resource, I'm going to encourage you to really, I'm always going to encourage you to really dive into what the content is and why. Don't just read stories because I tell you to read them. Don't just, do what it says in the curriculum. Go deeper. Get a clear picture of your child, of where they are, of where you are, how you're showing up. All of those pieces, they're so important as you're walking this path. So I cannot recommend our class 2 enough. This is our class 2 Waldorf curriculum. It goes through and gives you the story content, laid out lessons, and everything that you need to do as far as having it as a great backbone as you're doing your planning. Why do I say backbone? Well, it does have completely laid out lessons, but you're going to always want to add to it. You're going to want to bring your ownness to it, your own piece to it, because otherwise it's going to feel hollow and it's going to feel like you're just going through the motions every day, and we don't want that for you. So we definitely want you to do the planning, and part of doing that planning is to know and understand the stories. So let's talk about the stories. The literature content is really big in these first few grades before we're really diving into science pieces. But what's beautiful about this literature content is we are getting that little bit of life science in there, because we're going to be talking about animals in regards to fable content in class 2 as well. So don't dive deep, but know that you're getting that little bit in there as well. So I really love this book. This is called The Power of Stories. It is by a man named Horst Kornberger. It's really long. I will make sure that it is in our notes for this show. But I love this book because it sort of goes through, it goes through the story content sort of throughout the grades and why it's important and how it nourishes children. So I've got a couple of quotes here from the book that I want to read for you. And if you have the book, the quotes that I'm pulling are from chapter 14 on legends and saints. So this is what it says. And legends and saints would be for the child that is like 7 going on 8, not yet 9. So the content is different. And we're not talking about the first grade either. We're really talking about the second grade. Now, I will say that a lot of the content from first grade is definitely, it's still appropriate in second grade because second is very much an extension of first. However, there are developmental pieces that are sort of going on here and they need the next step, especially if you've done those fairy tales in class 1. So it says here, while traditional household tales or fairy tales are the offspring of the imagination, legends are the product of the intellect. So take that in for a minute. Legends are the product of the intellect. So we're going from this imagination space, very much early childhood space, to the next place. This links them to their older cousin, the fable, also fathered by the intellect. The fable uses the metaphor to illustrate moral concepts and ideas. So, rather than talking about how a child can be greedy, you can instead talk about or tell a story about that. And we'll go more deeply into that in part 2, sort of how you can choose story content that matches that. But just know that as you're walking through this, when we are giving something like a fable, we're not telling them what the moral is. We're just giving them the fable. We're not sort of going that next place because, well, one, we don't want to ruin it. I mean, everybody's had a situation where somebody's been like, well, this is what you did and this is how I feel about it. We don't want to do that for the children. We want the story to do the teaching. So we really want to be very careful about that space. So further on here it says, Aesop's fables deal with the unsavory aspects of the human soul. The unsavory aspects. So again, we talked about guilt, greed, those sorts of things. And I love the way we can do that with animal stories because it's abstract, but also very concrete for the children. It says, this is appropriate to the 8-year-old child. Children at this age become clever, and cleverly devised fables meet them on their own ground. The work is like a homeopathic. Clothed in the form of the fable, the intellect treats the very illness it causes. So, we're looking at this space where we might tell a story about an animal that has had, that has been greedy and how that ended up working out for them. And it works on our children. And even if the first one doesn't, you can find other stories that have that element. And I want to say too that all children have a greedy phase. All children have that space, even if that's not your family value. It happens. They're children. They're testing boundaries and figuring things out and really getting to know what it is like to walk in this world. You have, 10, 20, 30 years on them and you've learned these lessons, sometimes the hard way, right? But these are lessons that we want to sort of clothe them in as they're young. And then it goes on to talk a little bit about the saint legend. He says the saint legends do the same for the higher self. While the fable tends to portray vices in animal forms, legends depict virtues in the lives of saints and heroes. Between them, legend and fable, they provide a balanced picture of the human soul. The child needs such a picture to orient herself in the world she is slowly awakening to. So, often I'll talk to parents and they'll just say, oh, I'm just going to skip those saint stories because they stress me out and make me nervous. I'm just going to focus on animal stories. So I love this quote because it really illustrates this need to have both. We are looking at, those lower pieces, but we're also really wanting to appeal to that higher space for them. So some of my favorites animal stories or animal tales. I love Thornton Burgess. Now, I will say that there are some tales in Thornton Burgess that because of their age, you might want to change some of the wording in them just to make them a little more culturally appropriate. but the way the animals act to each other will have you rolling and laughing. It's pretty hilarious. The great thing about Thornton Burgess is you can get those for free. So those are available in many places online. Often like Kindle and Nook will have them as a download for free because there are so many of them. I'm talking hundreds of pages. There's so many of them that you really, unless you want the whole Thornton Burgess library, which is great, you really can get them much cheaper. What I also love about Thornton Burgess is there are then some tales, most of them are these younger tales, these tales of just the animals. But then you have some tales that are a little bit more, like there's the Thornton Burgess Seaside Tales, which is all about, what's going on at the ocean, at the seaside. And we loved those when we lived in San Diego, because it talked about animals and birds and the fish and the things that were going on in the tide pools. So it was great to sort of tie that in, but we use those as a separate extra book. Now you could use those later also in class 4 for some deeper animal tale studies. But I know there's a bird book and there's a seaside book, and I want to say there's an animal book as well. And they have some different characters in them than just the regular Thornton Burgess ones, Buster Bear and that kind of thing. I also really like the Tales of Uncle Remus. Now this would be another place where you want to make sure you read the content, because there might be some that are a little intense. Now, because they are really tricking each other and not kind to each other, pretty mean to each other, you want to make sure that any of the content is going to be meeting your child. Now, a lot of people use the Peter Rabbit tales. Those are also, tales of animals acting silly and doing things to each other that we see, working out in human life. So another one, people often ask me, what about Winnie the Pooh? And I think Winnie the Pooh could be okay, but it's so much on the tame side that I think that maybe if you have a younger second grader, which I would not, I would really work to have, be in age appropriate content, but Winnie the Pooh could be useful in some of those settings. We also like the Jataka Tales and the Anansi Tales. Those are all great. And we actually have a good mixture of those, again, within our Class 2 curriculum. All right, so saint content. Now, this is a place where sometimes people want to throw rocks at me. Don't throw rocks at me. There are several books. Now, I really like, we have great stories within our curriculum, so you don't actually need something else. But should you want more, there's this book, the Stories of the Saints, and I'll make sure we link all of these for you. This is a lovely, lovely book. It has many, many saint stories from saints that you may not, unless you're practicing Catholic, you may not know all of these stories. So there are some very interesting stories in here. And, I've had this book and used it for all of my children. It is a lovely book, and it has many, many saint stories. Again, on the subject of Christian saints, there is this book by Jacob Straight about Saint Francis. And then there's a book here actually by Robert Kennedy that is also about Saint Francis. I don't have many picture books in my main lesson content, but I do love the pictures in this book. So we've had this on our shelf for many years, and really love that book. In fact, I have a picture of the cover somewhere hanging in my house because it's one of my favorites for sure. There's a St. Nicholas book that's great for the second grade year when you're working through that block towards Christmas time. That would be a great one. And actually you don't have to only use it for class 2. You can use that for other times as well. There are books like this one. This is St. George and the Dragon. This one is longer and it's a deeper story. So you may want to use something like this as an extra story rather than a main lesson story. Again, because it has a lot of pictures. And when I'm using things for main lesson, I really try to use my voice to be the descriptor rather than a book. Of course, that's not always the case because, I have some illustrated Grimms that I really like for class 1. So it's not always the case. So there are others as well. So there are Hindu saint books. Now, I really like the 8-Year-Old Legend book by Isabel Wyatt. Now, she is not native to India, but these are beautiful stories. There's also another book called The Monkeys in the Mango Tree, which is another great book of Hindu saint stories. So if you are not Christian or not really nervous about those Christian saints, I want to encourage you to just keep studying, because there are other opportunities to bring sort of that beauty and goodness from that saintly life into the main lesson. So don't just stick with the animal tales because the other makes you uncomfortable. We want to really encourage you to truly understand the curriculum and truly understand what it is that your child needs at this time, because there is no book on our children. The book is the child. So we really want to be able to really take the time and get to know what it is that they need. All right, so that is it for part 1 of our Class 2 Literature podcast. Join us for part 2 coming up next. Find our Patreon at Ariel's Light. So Ariel's Light, if you haven't heard already, is the ministry that we started this year. Interfaith, so we welcome people of all faiths to come and experience and converse and really get to know this conscious parenting space. I see it as a space for people that might be deeply into their religion, like being able to go deeper in what that parent-child relationship means. And then people that are just trying to figure out, like, what does this inner work journey mean to me? You're in that space, and I've been there. You're trying to figure out, well, how do I bring what's welling up inside me to my children so that they aren't lost in confusion, so that they actually have this piece of goodness and beauty that Steiner always talks about. So the ministry has roots of anthroposophy, and we will be talking about things from an anthroposophical standpoint, but also really bringing you good content that you can bring into your life right now.